Oh, there it is. Okay, let's do that again. Welcome. It's a tradition to start with a land acknowledgement. Since this meeting is being held online, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture the richness of our distribution across many locations in Canada and around the world. As the Refugee Research Network is hosted at York University in Toronto, we would like to share the land acknowledgement that is used at York University, and we invite you today to consider your own territory. The Refugee Research Network acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishwaabeg Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. The Dish with One Spoon is an Indigenous hunting law used for centuries. One spoon signifies that all people sharing the territory are expected to limit the game they take to leave enough for others. I invite us all to reflect on this meeting and how it might inform our work and our research. And with that, I would like to introduce Susan McGraw. Next slide, please. Susan McGraw is a professor emerita and senior scholar at the School of Social Work at York University. She served as director of the Center for Refugee Studies from 2014 to 2012. She is the past president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration and the founding member of the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. Professor McGraw was awarded the 2015 SSHRC Partnership Impact Award for forging innovative, interdisciplinary, equitable, and cross-sector partnerships. And in 2014 was invested into the Order of Canada in the recognition of her outstanding achievement in research and policy on refugee rights. And of course, she is the founder and moving force behind the Refugee Research Network. Susan, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and over to you.
Thank you, Irina. And thanks to you and Dina Taha and Michelle Millard for organizing this webinar. Again, welcome to the third in the series of webinars on refugee research, with a focus on not just what knowledge is being generated in the field, but how to mobilize it, both the tools and strategies that can help researchers optimize the dissemination of their research findings. It's an initiative of the Refugee Research Network. It's funded in 2008 by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And the RN has been a global network of academics, students, practitioners, and policymakers built around relationships with refugee research centers across the global South and North. We continue to meet at the biennial conference of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, which will be virtual this year in July. Hopefully many of you will be able to join us and check out the IASFM website. Our guest speaker today has served as a member of the executive committee. My colleague, Julie Young, who's a Canada Research Chair at the University of Lethbridge and on the call today, and I have published an edited collection that seeks to capture and reflect on how the RRN tried to build networks for knowledge production and mobilization, what we were able to accomplish together, as well as the challenges. We've been deeply aware of the profound differences in capacity among researchers and research centers around the globe. The book, Mobilizing Global Knowledge, Refugee Research in an Era of Displacement, was published by the University of Calgary Press, and it is open and free access at their website, and the links will be posted in the chat box. One of the contributors of that book is today's guest speaker, Professor Nergis Canefe. In fact, she also designed the cover for the book. Professor Canefe holds 2 doctorates, one in political science and one in law. She's a Turkish-Canadian scholar of public international law, comparative politics, forced migration studies, and critical human rights. She's held posts in several European and Turkish universities and is a faculty member at York University, Canada since 2003. And I've had the good fortune of knowing her since 2004. She regularly serves at the executive board of several international organizations, including the International Association for Studies in Forced Migration, is co-editor of the Journal of Conflict, Transformation, and Security, a frequent public speaker on issues related to human rights, minority rights, and historical injustices. She's penned close to 100 scholarly articles and many books. Her most recent book is Limits of Universal Jurisdiction, a critical debate on crimes against humanity. She's published in all the major and leading journals. She's also a trained artist, and her designs and murals have been showcased regularly since 2008. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Nergis Canefe today, our guest speaker.
Nergis, you can go ahead and share your slides.
I will, thank you. I'm sorry for the glitch, just 1 sec. I'm having difficulty opening this at the moment. Almost there. Yes. Okay. Irina, it's telling me.
Do you want one of us to do ours?
Yeah, because it's telling me it's failing to share for some reason. Shall I try one more time?
It's okay. If you're comfortable presenting, just let me know when you want to move to the next slide and I'll do it.
Is it all right now?
Oh, it worked. Yeah.
Okay. Now I want to do what, yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay, we're good then. So thank you very much for this very generous introduction, as well as the opportunity to take part in the series. And what I would like to share today is part of ongoing work that will become an educational resource within the next few months as an open access web archive. And the work I've been doing towards this project has been more than 2 years, I think, and it's in collaboration with many colleagues and as well as people on the ground. So I owe a lot of thanks to a lot of people in terms of allowing me to articulate some of these ideas in a presentable fashion and hopefully in a form that will be publicly shareable. So ethics of witnessing is a term that I would like to take credit for myself. It was used in the context of Holocaust studies in a very particular way, but what I'm trying to do is develop it into a method as far as working with human suffering and in particular forced migration is concerned. And the reason why I think it's suitable to be presented as a discussion material in the series on knowledge mobilization and our own network is, I believe it has implications and benefits for both academics, scholars, teachers, lecturers, as well as emerging scholars, our students, and people who work on the ground, people who are activists, archivists, policymakers. So it's a large umbrella of interlocutors, so to speak, that I'd like to include in this debate. So just a bit of background information as far as where I hail from and why this has been very important for me for the last 30 years or so, my academic work life, as well as outside of academia work life, because I do a lot of pro bono work, training human rights lawyers and working with organizations in the Middle East. So I do come from the Global South originally. I'm a first generation Canadian immigrant scholar. And over my career, because at least part of my education has taken place in the Global South, I was fully aware and I had to acknowledge the North-South academic exchanges and the dynamic in them and the intellectual collaborations and research networks, by all accounts, had to be protected from what our colleague Lauren Landau refers to as tyrannies of partnership. And I know we've moved past that point, especially in the Canadian context. And thanks to the work of many of the colleagues who are part of RRN, it has really been possible to address these issues openly. However, there's still the concern that including research partners in the Global South does not necessarily emanate to an empowerment or an equalization of these dynamics. And sometimes it can lead to reproduction of some of the neocolonial setup of inequality. In fact, I believe next week there'll be a roundtable organized by the University of Ottawa that invites our refuge editor, Dagmar Schoeneken, and David Cantor, looking at the metrics of publication. As we know, the majority of the forced migration movements are taking place in the global south. But when they do the metrics, the journal metrics of who publishes what, there's a very small proportion of published work that is actually emanating from the global south in these major flagship journals. So this is not a debate that is only important for me, but this is something that is affecting most of us in our work. So one of the things that I emphasize in the overall structure, I'm sorry, I need to go back, is that including a Southern partner, so to speak, an NGO or a group of scholars from the Global South, or referring to their work in the curricula does not necessarily constitute an end in itself. It's in fact at the beginning point. And in my legal scholarship, I'm what's called a trail scholar, third world approaches to international law, and we expend a lot of energy building law curricula that incorporates work from the Global South, including court cases. But that's only the beginning of a conversation. And so one of the important aspects of that interaction is that it has to be framed in an engaged and transformative form, and it should be assumed to be a relationship rather than simply a transaction. Similarly, defining global outreach in terms of knowledge mobilization, and this goes back to my example a minute ago about journal publications and how much of it comes from the Global South, how much access is there and what circulates, and academic boutique publishing, and what kinds of work reach to the rosters of Routledge and Palgrave and Macmillan and many other publishers that we use in our courses. There is a certain logic of calculation in terms of efficiency output, parameters of recognition, what we call neocolonial tutelage. For instance, you have to come from an institution that's in the global north so that your work can actually be accessible. Even translation sometimes constitutes a big barrier, as well as conceptual issues, splits, fights about what it means. Let's say even the notion of global south sometimes constitutes a major point of dissension. When I tried to publish some years back about forced migration, migration as necessity in the global south, a very veritable journal out of England, the reviewer said, "What is the global south?" And I didn't know what to say, because it was even at that point, the term itself was contentious. The reviewer was asking, is this necessary to use that term? So these constitute veritable challenges in terms of this dialogue, the relationship, and then the flow of both scholarship and expertise and engagement. So in that sense, in my larger work, I advocate recognition of homelessness and yet profound influence of bridging acts in terms of coming up with critical redefinitions of key terms in the context of postcolonial theories, studies of indigeneity, alterity, border studies. There's a whole host of cognate disciplines and areas of study that allows us for these critical redefinitions. And we do understand that forced migration studies generically is an interdisciplinary endeavor. It's shared, and there are many stakeholders, both theoretically and practically. So the work that I'm engaging acknowledges all that, but wants to go one point beyond, one step beyond. And I call that beyond the vicious circle, because if you look at this graphic here, usually it depends on where you start, but often we start with the disciplinary home. And especially this is very important for our graduate students, but more so it becomes inculcated over time for established scholars as well. And the disciplinary home allows us to define or dictates upon us the kind of methodology that we will be using. And interestingly, we don't choose our methodology according to our audience, but in so many ways in the history of social sciences, humanities, and also legal scholarship, your methodology kind of leads you to the kind of audience that you will reach with your work. And depending on the kind of audience you reach, then the intent impact materializes. And depending on the intent impact, then you assume an ethical stance. So, and then this brings you back to the vicious circle of back to the disciplinary home, doing the same circle again and again and again. And what I'm hoping is that sometimes along the way, around the intent, impact, or ethical stance, you could actually depart from that circle and maybe develop another circle, or maybe go somewhere else and come back again. And it's not a circuitous route, but you have a moment to pause and redefine and take a critical stance. And so let's say if you're publishing at a mainstream high impact academic journal, if you're a geographer, then your methodology will be defined by the disciplinary training that you receive. And if you're publishing in an academic journal primarily, then your audience will be fellow academics, scholars, maybe on and off the old practitioner, and then those will be primarily used in classroom settings or internal debates. So your audience is very limited. And so the intent impact, the one that you're pushing for is the knowledge and mobilization component is really within academia and in the classroom. And as far as your ethical stance is concerned, the furthest you can go is the pedagogies in the classroom, and I'll talk about it in a minute, and then you come back again. So how do you actually break away from that cycle and then maybe go somewhere else, choose a different kind of audience, publish elsewhere, assume a different tone, take risks with your methodology, open it up, and maybe start with an ethical stance, or start with an impact, start with an audience, change it to the way the arrows are structured. So some of these issues are really, really key in terms of looking at scholarship as engagement. So one of the things that I preach, and I say this knowingly, in terms of scholarship on forced migration in particular, but human suffering in general, is there has to be a commitment to redefining what we're doing and the kinds of conversations we want to take part in. And there has to be a direct address of the gap between academia and communities whose voice and participation is vital to the sustainability of local, regional, and global understandings of the phenomena we try to witness, analyze, and change through our scholarship, research, and teaching. This is very, very important. They're not observation material. And that's called subjectification of victimhood, which I also explain. We have to really take a critical stance in terms of our relationship with our quote unquote research subjects. And there has to be a methodological investment in terms of coming up with different premises and recalibrating our established positions of knowledge production and dissemination. And what I mean by that is there is a growing trend in terms of disseminating and sharing your research findings with the very communities that you work with, as well as creating policy-friendly briefings, or working with NGOs and activist groups, or working with advocacy groups, and globally networking in terms of your findings, rather than just keeping it in silos, which goes again back to Susan and Julie's original book project and the whole RN motto of bridging. So when you start with established traditions of scholarship, disciplinary or otherwise, what I'm suggesting as method as intervention is you need to go through something called, or I call it, reauthentification of your position, so that you can actually help creation of intellectual and political space for the flourishment of alternative ideas that are relevant to current global current global and historical realities of injustice. And in the issue of forced migration, one of the first challenges we always deal with is that we try to define it not as a symptom, not as a moment in history, but as a continuation of trends and patterns. And that is really important in terms of positioning yourself in academia, in the larger debate in society, in policy arena, to underline the fact that this is one of the makers of modern societies. It's not an ad hoc thing. It's not just a blimp. It's not a symptom, but it's a very, very essential part of the maintenance of the global order right now. So the context, I mean, I put a triangle in there in the sense that often some of the most critical take on forced migration studies comes out of post-neoliberal, post-imperial, post-colonial insights, because they have a larger critique about the global system, and they zoom into debates on historical injustices, and they explain forced migration on that basis. And then I am guilty as charged as one of the contributors to this continuous stream of post-colonial migration and migration as necessity debate. Which not so much normalizes migration, but makes it essential to understand it as part of the system as opposed to it being an add-on. So initiatives in research and capacity building, which is really important for the RN network, we do need to examine very carefully the responses that emanate from global South and post-colonial contexts to the dominant paradigms of forced migration studies. And this has been done increasingly so. They're not the only critical voices, but on account of the mere statistics of the majority of forced migration movements, not only taking place in the global South, but also being absorbed in the global South, the distribution of emphasis has to change in terms of what kind of critique is coming from areas where forced migration is emanating and also taking place in full vitality. We also have to undertake close scrutiny of examples, displaying the direct correlation between an academics, researchers, and academics and researchers' self-inscribed positionality and methods and trajectories of critical knowledge production. Because the more you feel yourself as an outsider, and then the more you feel yourself as an observer, as opposed to what I call a witness, because witnessing comes with responsibility. The less you actually engage with critical knowledge, you describe and you take a step behind, away from what you're observing, and you don't necessarily embrace it with the kind of commitment if you were part of what was going on. And so it's really important to look at our stance in terms of how we study dispossession and displacement and what kind of stakes we have in terms of examining the issues that we do. And scholarship related to transnational migration studies, especially the kind, let's say our colleague Julie Young is doing that on border studies, and then there are many other newer cohorts of scholarship that's coming up that's challenging methodological nationalism in terms of forced migration. And the syndrome of seeing like the state, which means you don't order your priorities in terms of simply resettlement and reintegration, but you have larger questions. And if you do deal with these very important questions, then you contextualize them in a way that questions the status quo rather than accepting it and therefore seeing it like it is state and simply feeding into policy cycles. So tenets of critical inquiry. This is a much larger debate on method. What does it do? One of the things that equips, these kind of approaches equip us both as scholars and as emerging scholars is we can oppose dualistic understandings of membership, political membership, citizenship, crisis, exclusion, dispossession, in or out. There's a lot of gray that really helps you to understand the continuity. We can also propose a set of common norms pertaining to working with human suffering at a global scale, epitomized by forced migration, because forced migration, by and large, when you do comparative work, realize that it repeats a certain pattern. It doesn't matter which region, which state, but the tools that are used for exclusion and violence and oppression are pretty much the same. States learn from each other, so do societies. And ethics of witnessing in this context, I propose is a new framework for engaged scholarship and research, and I'll just explain it in a minute, because it allows for a conceptual mapping of historical and emergent hierarchies of knowledge production and dissemination. And it allows you to engage with the colonial practices attending to global patterns of dismemberment. So it gives you a larger vision, which makes you a viable witness, whether it's your society or someone else's society, whether it's borderlands, and I think it can produce a panacea for our colleagues. And I'm sitting on the fence, so I'm neither south nor north, but colleagues who are emanating from the global north, I think this kind of ethics also allows them to fully participate without feeling that they're re-encouraging the neocolonial project. I think it's really important that we can actually come up with this common understanding of forced migration and then new ways and old ways being all part of global patterns of dismemberment. And I think it has the potential of creating a new knowledge community in that regard. So the researcher scholar as witness, this is where I really get excited, and this is, I've been working on it, and I've presented parts of this work at the Osgood Law School seminars on migration and method and law. And there, my interlocutor was Jennifer Nadelsky, who is a very well-known ethics scholar, and she thinks this is quite a viable model. So I'm hoping that this will actually resonate within the larger ethics debate as well. The researcher as witness is the beginning point. So you start with the point of acknowledging that, I mean, you're not a participant observer, but you're actually part of that plan of the larger picture. Your attention and your presence alone really has the effect of the possibility of changing things, good or worse, good or better, better or worse. And witnessing comes as a responsibility. And I explain as to what this responsibility amounts to. I'll just give a few examples in a minute. And what this also means is that seeking justice requires resistance to representation, articulation of acts of violence as normal. So when you're witnessing, you start from the point of view that there's nothing normal about what's happening. It could have been normalized, but this is not the vision that the society should desire. So you actually acknowledge your own standpoint, that this is not what you want to see as a world. This is not something that you want to be a part of as your heritage in the world. And then you have to openly say that, because that gives you agency and an embedded political stance in your scholarship. And I do realize that majority of 20th century training is about neutrality and positions of neutrality. But I think as far as human suffering is concerned, if you choose the position of neutrality, that actually has very negative connotations as to what you're doing. And the last leg of researcher scholar as a witness is capitalizing on the non-specificity of the unrepresentable. And this is Arendtian language, because what you're witnessing is sometimes so egregious, so above and beyond description and acceptance. There is a tendency to be lulled into the details and the horrendous nature of what's happening, which is normal, is a human reaction, but that also keeps you right in that spot, and you get absorbed by the event. As a scholar researcher, you have to have that critical distance and then pull yourself out and realize that there are similar instances happening elsewhere. This is a pattern-based and the systemic problem, rather than just being peculiar to Burma and the Rohingya crisis, or just being peculiar to Sri Lankan conflict and Tamil refugees. Like there are underlining similarities, which we call non-specificity, which then allows you to move forward in terms of engaging in global scholarship. So, how much time do I have? I'm so sorry, I didn't look at the time. Do you know how much time do I have?
Yeah, you have like probably another 10 minutes or so.
Okay, that's good, thank you. So capitalizing the scholar's responsibility as witness, I think helps us in tackling the conundrums of scholarly research, in the sense that there's a certain disconnect between scholarly findings and questions and, let's say, policy circles or activism or advocacy or social movements, at least in some instances. And I think the more we are open to the possibility of being an active party just by witnessing, just by documenting, just by narrating, just by thinking about things, the more we can have the benefits for institutional and social anchorage in terms of what we do. There is another aspect of scholarship which is very essential, and I called it the pedagogies of hope, and I'm not the only one who talks about this. There's a long tradition emanating from South America, but also from the Middle East, where you see the classroom and the university as an endemic political community and a learning community. So it's not the funnel vision where you give and they take, but it's an interaction, and then there is really formation of ideas and and inspirations for the future of the society. So it's really important also when you're sitting in front of the classroom as a scholar, you engage with pedagogies of hope, you engage with alternative visions, but you also identify your stance as a scholar. You're not just an observer, but you're a participant in that social order. You're occupying a position of power by sitting in that chair as a university professor to start with. And I always tell my students, on an average good year, I have the privilege of encountering somewhere between 700 to 1,000 young people. And that's an awful lot of responsibility. Not all of them may listen to me, but nonetheless, I have the chance of interacting with them. So in that sense, when we face our classrooms and our students, but also particularly graduate students, emerging scholars that we train to be standing on their own as knowledge producers for the next generation, we must combine philosophical argument, ethical standing, methodological analysis, and a case is drawn from actual scholarly practice. It cannot just be the literature. It cannot just be the key names defining that field. You have to contextualize it so the next generation of scholars are also coming out of that institution imbued with the sense of responsibility that what they're doing matters. And it really matters in terms of human dignity and in terms of redefining the context that we exist by asking new questions about the discipline and the world at large. Alternative paths. So knowledge mobilization, invoking, challenging, improving societal norms is not necessarily the kind of language you see, let's say, on a SHRC application, although this is changing. There are additions made, but it is a legitimate form of activity, and it's not just for scholarship's sake. It is actually a legitimate political activity that includes agency. You actually affect public opinion. You actually ask questions that could mobilize certain kinds of further questions or inquiries in the public domain. You can also interact with public policy domains, and you can interact with international institutions as well as domestic political institutions. Those are all within the purview of scholarship. And therefore, what I'm pushing for, and then I'm hoping to embody it in my own work, in the way that I live, it's not just the university you function within, but you've published elsewhere, you speak elsewhere, you reach out, and you don't turn down invitations where the audience is not an academic audience, only you engage, because in effect, you're working with human suffering, and they're not your subjects of research only, these are real people, and therefore you have the responsibility, and this is part of the ethics of witnessing business, of identifying interlocutors and interacting with larger communities. You cannot just keep this information to yourself for academic circulation. And then there are also questions about scholar, researcher acting as a witness to the demands of not just social change, but legal change. Interestingly, this kind of work is much more common among legal scholars, partially because they engage in litigation, and partially because whatever debates they engage in terms of advocacy, they then write on it. So like there's more of an overlap, but otherwise, there tends to be quite a difficulty bringing your scholarly work to your societal profile and engaging at multiple platforms and moving beyond system maintenance and social control, which have been habitual duties imposed on scholarship. So witnessing under turmoil, this is the hardest part. And then this is taking a lot of my time and effort, and I think it will take in the next 10 years or so. This is about working under conditions which are related to war, civil conflict, severe trauma, acute dispossession, totally volatile. And I mean, there are multiple aspects of engaging in scholarly or research work under these circumstances, but as a professor, you have the ultimate responsibility of making sure that not only you don't harm the communities that you work with, but let's say if you're sending students there, you have to make sure that they're safe and secure. Even if they are from that community, it is not an open terrain. You don't just go into a war zone and then start doing field work. I've lost students, and I'm sure other people did too. And it wasn't my doing per se, but the terrain that they went into is basically infested with uncertainty and death. And if they go there, then they are a moving target for so many reasons. So one has to then cultivate pedagogical conditions necessary for students working with human vulnerabilities and human suffering to become critical witnesses to violence, systemic rights violations, suspensions of legal civil order, political and personal trauma, and society-wide oppression. And there's no guarantee whatsoever if your student goes to Iran, if your student goes to Sri Lanka, if your student goes to Cyprus, if your student goes to any of the war zones, that they're not going to be identified as a public enemy by the government. There's no guarantee for that. If one thinks otherwise, one is being not only foolish, but irresponsible. So what do? Not send people to work in these regions? No, but you have to give them the adequate training. If necessary, you have to give them the legal backing. They have to link up with NGOs and INGOs and advocacy groups. So they're not going there alone. They're actually part of a network. This is an essential responsibility when you're training younger generations to work in such conditions, which are really, how shall we say, as I said, infested with death and danger. And then they're not going to be immune to those. But there is the other part of working as a scholar, researcher under turmoil, which is it opens you up to effective possibilities in terms of emoting, in terms of relating, because you cannot keep that critical distance. Let's say I had a student who was working with downtown Vancouver cohort of homelessness and refugees and drug users, like as a bunch there taken together as a policy concern. And the more she did work, and she was trained as a social worker initially, but the more she did actual work on the streets, the more she started building a really robust understanding, an effective understanding, not just in terms of numbers and the needs and then the policy framework, but in terms of the livelihoods and the testimonies of these people. So it really makes you more endowed as a human being. It matures you. It gives you different insight. So it's not just from the university to the street, back to the university as your safe haven, but you start feeling at home in the world the more you engage directly. Not just as an observer, but also as a witness. So, and this goes back to our capacity for caring and for us to somehow embody an ideal of equality in a substantive way. We do need to have a vision based on a recognition of shared humanity and dignity of the subjects of research and forced migration. And I know almost all of us start from that point of view, but most of the time, if you haven't been encountering these kinds of situations, then it's an assumed shared humanity. You don't necessarily have the bare bones understandings of the living circumstances and then the life stories of these groups and communities. And therefore, it's essential to be there, to be part of it, and to endure the sight of suffering in so many ways that you cannot do something immediately. But part of the reason why you're there is that nothing immediate can be done. And then you're there to document and to disseminate it and to make it known and then to make it visible. So, I mean, the rest of the slides we'll talk about, I think I prepared far too many slides for this kind of talk, but when this becomes an RN webinar, hopefully people will have a chance to go over these slides themselves. Of course, there are gendered and racialized nature of these systemic practices of exclusion, denunciation, decimation, and annihilation of human lives. And you might choose to concentrate on one or the other aspect or intersectionalities. That's fine. And then that's actually essential for doing the kind of work you do. But at the same time, the onus is on you not to be lost in theoretical debates, but realize that these subjects that you're defining and theorizing in the meantime are still living in those conditions. You come home and then you write about them and you lecture about them, but they still remain in that camp. They still remain in that border zone. Life continues there. And it's a very painful, how shall we say, moment of awareness to realize that, yes, you are a part of it, but you're not able to stop it or change it immediately, but you have to be part of that continuum. And so one of the things I do, I teach at York most of my time. And when I'm teaching critical human rights, I ask my students, look outside, what do you see? And then they see the high rises at Jane and Finch. And then I say, so what's the difference between those communities and you? And they go like, well, we don't understand. And I said, well, they can't have access to this university, although they're right there and you can have access to this university by and large. And that's the social structure, right? So it's like building up recognition, awareness constantly, as painful as it is part of the responsibility of acting as a witness. Method training. There are many ways disciplines influence the way we approach methodologies. But as far as forced migration is concerned, I think we really have to weave the themes of violence, oppression, historical injustices, identity, class, as well as other intersectionalities. And academic education and forced migration studies can indeed become a platform upon which inequalities and injustices are discussed openly, rather than presumed to be falling outside the capabilities of the scholar to engage with. So that's a very potent position. I think forced migration studies is distinct in that sense, and maybe I'm biased, but I really do think that because we always talk about what's rendered as outside or at the margins or borderlands or limbo, that actually reveals the failings of the system much more accurately. Affect-based learning, we talked about how to deal with traumatic events and cases of political and socioeconomic violence. These have to be included in the curriculum, not just as theoretical debates. I am a great defender of case studies and documentaries. And what I do is, instead of sharing them in class time, I make people watch them, take notes. Sometimes I actually make people prepare a list of relevant audiovisual materials and testimonies and NGOs and INGOs about the class topic, so that they're aware of the larger world that is related to the kind of particular trauma that we're dealing with. And learning objectives moving beyond eliciting reactive responses to trauma. This is really essential, because after so many years of teaching war crimes and egregious crimes, the worst thing you can do is bombard your public with these horrendous images and taunting stories. Either people get overwhelmed or they go numb. And the reactive response is not what you want. You want an enlightened and encouraging kind of guidance to your students and the public in terms of considering alternative understandings and meanings to these narratives of human suffering, so you can avoid the pitfalls of voyeuristic engagements as well. So there's a lot of again, you are accountable for your actions as you are interfacing with your public or publics in terms of deciphering what you see and what you understand, because these are, for the most part, very violent episodes. And the first human reaction is to marginalize them as a one-off, and then the second reaction is to feel overwhelmed and think, what can I do? That's the way of the world. And then you have to provide an alternative meaning, an alternative reading. So therefore, rendering your classroom or your public, whichever segment of the public you're dealing with as a venue for debate, critical understanding, and affect-based engagement, asking people questions about where they would like to go. And there has been a traditional divide between academia and policymakers. And over the years, when I worked with policymakers and worked with colleagues who had policymaking backgrounds, I think there's a lot of richness there in terms of that collaboration, because they do have a very direct engagement with the public. And I think it's essential to work with them as much as possible as allies on a similar platform, and include their questions in our work as well.
Nergis, just giving you heads up for 2 minutes wrap up.
Okay. So politics of storytelling. I mean, this is a very important tool, and Narrative has re-entered registers of scholarly work, as well as living archives. And what I will do is I'll actually prepare a list of, well, I did, but not in the slide. I will prepare it for circulation for the RRN, of sample works that engage with forced migration studies from the standpoint of responsible witnessing. So, and the common point for all of these kinds of engagements is that they really acknowledge the power of storytelling, and not in terms of listening to others people's stories or collecting testimonies, but putting together narratives using alternative forms of representation, documentaries, movies, songs. There's a whole genre of writing that's called narrative politics, and they engage with these forms of presentation of violent trends, and there is an intermesh between the narratives and testimonies of refugees and asylum seekers and people who lost dear ones, and the researcher on the field, and that's called co-writing. And I just did an introduction to a volume that came out of 7 years of work in Afghanistan and other fields of war, where the author co-wrote her a big edition with the people that she worked. So there are different kinds of openings, and it doesn't mean this is the only thing you do, but I think more and more so, this is one of the important aspects of engaging with the people on the ground, in the field, in real life, who are the subjects of dispossession and forced migration in general. So let me see what else is happening here. Accountability, we already talked about it, that you're accountable not just to the university or institution, but you're accountable to the people that you work with. That is very, very essential. And then there's a whole movement right now about ethics of research, do no harm principle. That's a part of it, an essential part of it, but it doesn't cover the whole of it. You're also accountable in my eyes, and this is what my work is pushing for, to the whole society, and because you are the one who can tell what they cannot see, what they choose not to see, what they're not shown, and from the margins to the borderlands to the non-status people, you carry the responsibility of being accountable for accurate representation of what's going on, and in a continual fashion. Subjectification of victimhood, we already talked about it in terms of stories, but if you have time, I would invite you to look at some of these points. Streamlining dispossession, this is a very important aspect of doing work as a research scholar in this field, because what happens is the people that you work with become hyper visible while you're doing work with them and while they're negotiating citizenship and rights. And they're often blamed for initiation of the variability. They're categorically considered as masses, folding in and folding out of public spaces rather than individuals, families, and communities. So these are dangers in terms of when you present your findings and enter the debate, the initial public response will not be engaging with their individual stories, but creating this kind of mass of, unknowns or potential threats. And then therefore you have to really go against the streamlining of dispossession in your work. Paradigm shifts is an essential part of what you're doing. We talked about redefining key concepts. Tools of the trade. I don't think I have time to discuss these, but we can go over them in the question and answer period. But one of the essential tools of the trade is redefining our approach to collecting data. What constitutes data? and what we collate as data and how we keep it, how we protect it. And the new trend in refugee archives and archival work in living archives is an epitome of that careful understanding of what data means. And you are basically guardians of the data that you collect, because you're not talking about people who have full citizenship or status, and the information that you collect without you will disappear. So you have to also use institutional initiatives to protect that data in a way that doesn't harm the people that we work with. And the conclusions. So the research community must move beyond the sense of what could we do, nothing more than research and document and theorize, towards an ethical stance through which the utterance of there must be and are other ways for living, for engaging, for asking questions is embraced openly. And I think we must train our students, our emerging scholars, our colleagues, because as far as I'm concerned, young scholars, younger scholars, and then that's also a misnomer too. There are people who come back to university in their 40s and 50s, and that's a place for them as well. So our young colleagues or next generation of colleagues, I think we have to really embrace the motto of ask new questions and envisage new ways of approaching these what looks like perennial issues concerning gross and systemic human suffering. And there's a direct relationship between witnessing as a form of responsibility and assuming agency and power to affect change. What we do can count. What we do does count. It's just that we're not fully aware in academia. And I think that there's a whole history, institutional history, of the separation of the public intellectual from the scholar who produces academic work. And then I really think that gap should be bridged more and more, especially in the field that we're working in. And then there's an addendum I put there. And there I talk about something that's dear to RRN, which is how do you promote progressive and engaged scholarship? Who are your interlocutors? It's not just universities and research centers, but there's also many other actors in the field that you should always be connected to. And I mean, in effect, in the Canadian funding scheme, there's growing emphasis on partnerships, community partnerships, and then bringing them into academic work. So I think that's a very positive development. The one last thing I want to talk about is there are a few names I want people to keep in mind. And as I said, I will upload the information about their ongoing projects. So there's a group that is emanating from, sorry, I need to stop screen sharing, is that right? Yeah, there we go. From University of London and environs, and there are 3 conglomerations of work that's coming out. One of them is about changing the nature of archives and creating living refugee archives, and they connect with existing archival networks, libraries, and government institutions. So again, it's about synergies, building synergies, but creating guidelines and almost bylaws about the protection of these refugee voices and oral histories, written or recorded, and bringing together disparate collections under one umbrella. So that has been a very successful initiative. Our colleague Anita Fabos has been very, very instrumental in terms of redefining refugee narratives and then using them in a testimonial fashion rather than just oral histories to be cited. And in this case, testimony has a legal meaning in the sense that it really stands for a different rendition of truth than what we see as represented by the states and its organs. There is another group that looks at Southern responses to migration, and they have kept very active blog that engages discussions among scholars from the global north and the global south that looks specifically on forced migration issues. Some of the debate kind of concentrated on Palestinian and Syrian migration, forced migration trends, but a lot of beautiful methodological discussions. And I use it as a site for my students as well, graduate students, to refer to. there is a documentary filmmaker who is also a scholar, and she is part of a whole network of scholars, anthropologists, ethnographers who work through documentary filmmaking as part of their action research. And when they produce movies, they actually put in the credits the subjects that they work with. So it's part of the co-producing trend. So it's not just the researcher and the filmmaker, but also the people whose stories that we're sharing. And when they receive awards, she invites, in fact, she puts a condition for, let's say, the refugee youth that she worked with who are part of the movie, or the people who gave testimonies, at least some of them, to come on board to receive the award. And she's been receiving many awards. And so like it's a very...
Nergis, we're coming to the end of our time, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So anyhow, I mean, there are many examples how you engage with these kinds of hybrid forms of knowledge mobilization and production. I'm so sorry. This is a very exciting topic for me. So
Thank you so
Well,
much.
and it was a passion presentation. I must say, I think it's so encouraging for scholars, emerging scholars, people who are coming into the field, and an excellent presentation. So really, thank you. Irina, you want to?
Yeah, so thank you so much. This was so interesting and informative and thought-provoking. I'll open it up for just maybe a couple of questions before we wrap it up, unless some individuals want to stay past the 4 o'clock point. Do we have any questions right now? I did have one question asking about what are the key takeaways from your presentation?
right. I mean, if you go back to the slides, there are, I think, 4 points of entry in terms of key takeaways. So a most important practical one is the tools of the trade. How do you do this kind of work? How do you act as a witness with responsibility and accountability? How do you collect data? How do you circulate it? How do you interact with your interlocutors? How do you exchange what you find out with the public? So I think these are really important considerations, and often they come as an afterthought unless you're an established scholar and writing a grant. And I really think as we're training our students, they should actually be brought to a closer moment in the examination of what we're doing and how we're reaching out. Another key takeaway is the way that you interact with communities and scholars in the Global South, the partnership issue. And my colleague Richard Saunders has just got a huge multinational, multi-million-dollar grant working on forced migration extractive industries in African countries. And I conducted an interview with him. And there are certain inner dynamics about how you include your stakeholders in the workings of your grant even, how you come up with joint decision-making processes. And so it's really, really important that the Southern partners, so to speak, are really engaged in the whole process, as opposed to just providing information. The third point is really about academia being cut off from society. And I know in the Canadian context, there's a growing trend to bridge that gap. And York is known for that. And so we can only encourage that further. And then the final one is the pedagogies of hope. And this has been very critical for me, because I've been teaching at York for a long time. And prior to that, I also taught in critical progressive institutions. And we teach how to critique, but we don't necessarily endow our students and our community with the ability to imagine otherwise. So we critique and we unpack, but we don't necessarily give the tools, neither do we necessarily engage with those tools ourselves to imagine a different future. And I think it's really important when you work with human suffering to have that ability, or at least to spend thought in how we can do things differently.
Thank you so much, Nergis. So I think we'll just wrap it up now. There are ways to stay connected with the RN. First and foremost, mark your calendars for the next webinar, which is scheduled for March 31st at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. It will be on borderless higher education for refugee project in Dadaab refugee camp, and will include 2 students from the camp along with Professor Fiona Giles and Dawn Dippo. Also, please share your work with us. You may get in touch with Michelle Millard or Dina Taha, and their contact information I just shared in the chat. Sign up for the digest, follow us on social media. Also, our social media is in the chat as well. And just another reminder for the students enrolled in the York University Center for Refugee Studies Certificate and Diploma Programs, please sign the attendance. Thank you so much. It was great having you all.